Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Needy No More, the podcast dedicated to healing the anxious attachment style. I'm your host, anxious attachment style coach and author, Chris Ratcliffe. I've helped thousands of people across 6 continents to end the cycle of anxious attachment through my books, workshops, digital downloads, and coaching program. I'm excited to carry on that mission here in the podcast, sharing tools and techniques, principles and practices for you to explore on your journey to growing more secure. Welcome back to the podcast, everyone. We are in episode 3, and today we will be covering all things codependency. What is codependency? What are some early warning signs that you might be falling into codependent tendencies? And of course, what can you do about it? How can you combat or conquer codependency? That's what we'll cover today. First things first, we need to define what codependency is because while often discussed, it is widely misunderstood. The first thing I'm going to do is to read you a chapter from my book, Needy No More, which focuses on explaining this part in the cycle of anxious attachment. Remember, in the podcast so far, we've been exploring those different steps in the cycle. Last week, we talked about trauma. The week before, in the first episode of the podcast, I introduced the cycle. Codependency is one of the 6 steps in the cycle of anxious attachment. Trauma, codependency, abandonment, nervous system dysregulation, stress aversion, and addiction. So we're going to explore all of these, and today you'll see even further how these all overlap and relate to one another to cause the experience of anxious attachment. But without further ado, let's go ahead and dive into the chapter here. It's called The Loss of Self. Codependency is the loss of self, a form of self-abandonment in which we engage in order to prevent someone else from abandoning us. It's also a core characteristic of the experience of anxious attachment. But please hear me clearly when I say this, taking in each and every word and allowing the full sentiment to sink in. You can't build a resonant relationship with someone else when the relationship you have with yourself is dissonant. When you abandon yourself to be with another, you'll never fully believe that they won't abandon you too. If you'll do it to yourself, then why won't they? Ultimately, this is a form of projection, and typically one we've failed to notice in our relational history. If codependency is the loss of self, then enmeshment is the process by which that loss occurs, defined by a deep desire to be completely consumed by a person, as well as our relationship with them. The main purpose of seeking enmeshment is to create a sense of intense physical, intellectual, and emotional intimacy with someone. It's an aching, a longing, a pining, an addiction. And it stems from an obsession with romantic love and a fear of abandonment by others. We latch on and we don't want to let go. This is clearly neither healthy nor sustainable. Enmeshment-seeking behavior can be caused by a history of relationships that are defined by disconnection, dysfunction, and deprivation. Put another way, what we didn't receive when we were young and impressionable is what we compulsively crave when we're grown and emotionally stymied. We're starved for attention, stability, validation, affection, presence, and connection, for love. We've become so accustomed to the instability we've experienced that we don't know any better but to seek it out again in our relationships, desperately hoping it will play out differently this time, but to no avail. This kind of behavior can also be caused by the presence of enmeshment seeking in one or both parents. As always, we desire what we were deprived of and mimic what was modeled for us. The irony is that even though we are seeking to overcompensate for our past through a romantic partnership, this is the opposite of what love and partnership truly mean. A relationship built on overcompensation is also built on guilt and pity. Give this to me because I didn't receive it in the past becomes the premise. This is rooted in control and manipulation. I define love as the acceptance of another person as they are and the freedom for them to show up as their authentic self. With this definition in mind, enmeshment is the complete and total opposite because it asks the other person to overcompensate for our past instead of being who they actually are. Additionally, this relational strategy naturally creates inertia. Coming together in intensity almost always ends with the equal and opposite effect, and the relationship is typically over just as quickly and intensely as it began. Because of the intense outward flow of energy when we finally find someone whom we actually like, we become depleted. The more our energy is sent externally, the more deprived we become. And so we end up needing more from others for the simple reason that we aren't giving it to ourselves. We're spending so much of our emotional energy on someone else that there's nothing left over for us. We become codependent. The more codependent we become, the more we seek enmeshment. The more we seek enmeshment, the more codependent we become. Codependency is the vehicle, enmeshment is the engine, self-abandonment is the fuel. Love bombing is another factor that needs to be considered here. When someone bombards an anxious attacher with compliments, affection, and validation, it's an almost euphoric experience. It's all we've ever wanted, desired, craved. In these moments, our sense of lack and inadequacy fades away. We're finally worthy in someone else's eyes. It feels good to be chosen, but it feels even better to be chosen loudly and often. Love bombing is seductive. It's also manipulative. This experience isn't based on the slow build of real connection. It's throwing caution to the wind. It's being pedal to the metal. It's dishonest and disingenuous, but it is highly effective, particularly on the anxious attacher who's oftentimes been starved for love and doesn't know what it really looks or feels like. Some anxious attachers may even become addicted to the high they get during these intense relationships and develop an unconscious craving for the stress their body experiences when the high eventually wears off. Other anxious attachers become love bombers themselves, embodying the very strategy that's been used on them in order to ensure they experience the intensity they're seeking and reduce the likelihood that they'll be abandoned. In fact, one could characterize love bombing as a type of enmeshment seeking, though enmeshment seeking need not necessarily take that form every time. No matter what you call it, enmeshment, self-abandonment, and codependency are deceptive and disruptive to healthy, fulfilling, long-lasting relationships. They can also prevent the kind of connection we crave and keep us from having the kind of stable and consistent relationships we need in order to heal the dysregulation in our nervous system and stress in our bodies. What many people don't realize is that codependency is a parasite for both people involved. When we overextend and self-abandon in order to assuage the other person, we actually rob them of the opportunity to manage themselves. Discomfort is motivating. When we take on that which is not our burden to bear, we punish ourselves and we keep the other person atrophied, causing them to need us. Often we do this unconsciously and automatically, so they won't leave us, only to discover that the imbalanced dynamic that we've created will often end in abandonment nonetheless. We also do this because of the simple reason that we do not believe ourselves to be worthy of having a stable partnership, one where we're considered equals. We're still working to gain the acceptance and approval of those who abandoned us previously. We throw ourselves into new relationships, expecting them to overcompensate for the past. We seek intensity with others because we think that will provide us with the evidence we need to firmly believe ourselves worthy of love. But intensity is never the answer for inadequacy. What's present in the cause of our behavior will be present in its effects. Attempting to enmesh with someone else because we deem ourselves unworthy means that our unworthiness will follow us into that relationship. even when our attempts to enmesh are successful, even when we find someone who's willing to be complicit in our codependence. Codependency is yet another expression of life at the extremes. Time and energy are finite resources. When we're so focused on what's happening around us, it's impossible not to lose sight of what's happening within us. When we're spending all our time and energy managing our relationships with others, it's natural that we'll have very little left over to manage our relationship with ourselves. If, like many other anxious attachers, you've found that you lose yourself in your relationships, it's time to do some introspection. Ask yourself, how can I maintain a sense of self in my relationships? What would it look like for me to give a bit less to others so I can give more to myself? What would I need to do differently in order to achieve a sense of balance in my relationships? Reflect on your answers to these questions. Allow your inner sense of knowing to guide you. And listen, truly listen. Your voice of intuition will tell you everything you need to know and help carry you through to the kind of stable connection you crave. So, as you can see and hear, codependency is the loss of self. It can also be defined as locating your center of gravity in another person. It is a form of extreme dependence on others where we lose any sense of independence. Those are the two polarities that, from an attachment standpoint, inform where you are at on the attachment spectrum. You've got independence and you've got dependence. If you're overly independent, you are an avoidant attacher. If you're overly dependent to the point of growing codependent, then you're an anxious attacher. Disorganized or fearful avoidant or anxious avoidant attachers cycle back and forth between these polarities or these extremes. Another way to think about codependency, another way that people describe a codependent relationship, is being in a one-sided relationship. So if you feel like you're in that kind of dynamic, you are probably in a codependent relationship. Another way you might hear a codependent relationship described is that other person has been placed on a pedestal. Any sort of talk about putting someone on a pedestal means that the connection is imbalanced and likely a codependent one. In fact, the creation of an imbalanced power dynamic is a kind of savior complex in which many of us engage because it recreates a familiar, traumatic dynamic from our past. And typically, it's one that we had with our parents or a former romantic partner or both. You must also recognize that the pedestal on which you place a romantic partner is built on your self-abandonment. Remember that quote from the chapter that I read. Codependency is the vehicle. Enmeshment is the engine. Self-abandonment is the fuel. As I mentioned, codependency is also a core component of the cycle of anxious attachment. Trauma, codependency, and abandonment are the main cycle, with the subcycle being nervous system dysregulation, stress aversion, and addiction. These all relate to one another. As you heard me read in the chapter, codependency is a form of self-abandonment. It is also a form of trauma that involves others. It's driven by nervous system dysregulation, and it's a form of addiction. Part of why I keep repeating this cycle to everyone here and why I took so much time to explain this cycle in the book is because if you really want to end the cycle of anxious attachment, you need to interrupt these experiences. Now, I want to expand a little bit further on the connection between codependency and addiction, because it's one that tends to fly under the radar, and I think it's really informative and important for people to establish for themselves that this is a form of addiction. So I'm going to read another chapter from the book that goes deeper into this connection, and it is quite literally called The Codependency Addiction Connection. It's impossible to talk about codependency without talking about addiction. But what is addiction exactly, and how is it different from and related to codependency? They're more connected than you might realize. First, it's imperative to define what codependency and addiction actually are. As you read in the last chapter, I describe codependency as the subversion and loss of the self in order to build or maintain relationships with others. Put another way, codependency is the tendency to self-abandon in order to prevent abandonment by others. On the other hand, addiction is defined by an inability to tolerate reality, as well as the unhealthy coping strategies we employ in order to disengage from that reality. One of the reasons the relationship between codependency and addiction can be difficult to grasp is because each is both a cause and effect of the other. Many codependents turn to addiction to manage their feelings of inadequacy and shame, as well as the unconscious sense of guilt they feel for not taking better care of themselves. Whether through substances, sex, gambling, or something else altogether, these addictions help codependents cope with the intolerable reality they experience in which they believe themselves not to be worthy of love or deserving of a safe and stable partnership. Conversely, the unhealthy cycles of addiction lead to codependency, as they make it difficult to maintain a healthy relationship with oneself and often cause us to self-abandon by extension. This is true of someone engaging in addictive cycles themselves and also of someone witnessing the cycle of addiction in which another person is engaged. Put plainly, you don't have to be an addict to experience the natural state of codependence that results from having someone in your inner circle who's experiencing addiction. It's absolutely natural to want to save someone who doesn't want to save themselves and to lose ourselves in the process as a result. I know this to be true because I lived it firsthand. As I wrote earlier, and as I talked about earlier in the podcast, 3 generations of women on my mom's side died from addiction. My grandma and my mom from alcoholism, and my sister Michelle from opioid addiction. My mom most influenced my experience of addiction and development of codependence. So I'll focus on our relationship to demonstrate how codependence and addiction are intertwined. Growing up, when I'd visit my mom in Florida, I was dumbfounded as to why she needed to rely on drinking and smoking to get through the day. In school, I was taught these substances were bad for you and something to be approached with caution, or avoided altogether. As such, I hid her cartons of cigarettes around the house, leaving a pack here and a pack there, almost like a scavenger hunt. When my mom was distracted while cooking or away at the store, I'd also dump her bottles of vodka down the drain, or flush them down the toilet. I'll never forget the looks of disdain and disappointment with which I was greeted each and every time I acted out in these ways, desperate to interrupt her cycle of self-harm. I also see how these actions as a child are directly linked to my protest behavior and attempts to control my relationships as an adult. While I didn't understand it at the time, it wasn't my responsibility to intervene. It wasn't my cycle to break. It wasn't my addiction to heal. My focus on my mom and her unhealthy habits became an issue for me. While we didn't have much time together because we lived so far apart, I still found it challenging to remain present with her. My mind was constantly fixated on when she'd light another cigarette or pour another drink. I'd complain and nag and guilt her. I'd request for her to refrain. I'd tell her that if she loved me enough that she would quit, but none of it ever helped. Why would it? It only reinforced the inadequacy and shame that drove her to engage in the addictions in the first place. It took me many years and a lot of deep introspection to realize that it was this dynamic that perpetuated the addictive cycle for my mom and fueled my inclination towards codependency as an adult. But it was remarkable when it finally clicked. I've also witnessed this realization in my work with coaching clients. Nearly a third of all of the clients with whom I've worked have experienced addiction in their nuclear family. Others have also experienced addiction in their adult relationships, whether through one or both parents, with a friend or romantic partner, or even on their own. Anxious attachment and addiction go hand in hand because codependence and addiction go hand in hand. That said, not all addicts are necessarily anxious attachers. Addiction and the shame that drives it do not discriminate based on attachment style, though the trauma that leads to insecure attachment, be it anxious, avoidant, or disorganized, makes those styles more prone to develop one or more addictions as a form of coping. I once heard codependency described as locating your center of gravity in another person. This is an accurate depiction. When we become codependent, we get sucked into the gravitational force of another human being. We become consumed by the relationship itself. It starts eating up all of our time. It becomes our sole focus. So much so that we often stop making time for the things that make us feel balanced in our lives. We don't reach out as much to friends and family. We aren't investing as much time into our hobbies, passions, interests, goals, hopes, and dreams. We stop taking care of ourselves in the replenishing and rejuvenating ways we did when we were single. The less we show up for ourselves, the more we need the other person, and the cycle starts over. Addiction is similar in that it also causes us to place our center of gravity in something else. Whether it's a substance, a person, or an experience, we become completely pulled into its orbit, and we leave our own. This is, of course, the goal of addiction: to leave behind, disengage from, and forget about something that is overwhelming and intolerable for our system. One of the main differences between codependency and addiction is that codependency is always a dynamic between two people. On the other hand, while we can become addicted to a person, addiction also extends to objects, ideas, and experiences. The form of addiction doesn't matter so much as its ability to help us numb and escape our current reality. In this regard, all codependent relationships are a type of addiction, but not all addictions are codependent relationships. You can have a gambling addiction, shopping addiction, internet addiction, exercise addiction, and so forth. Not all addictions require the participation of another person. Codependency always does. While the connection between codependency and addiction can be difficult to grasp and accept, it can also help shed some light on the origins of our anxious attachment style, and thus aid in healing from the original traumas that caused our own unique pathways of coping to develop. As with anything from a healing standpoint, awareness and understanding are the first steps. Take some time to reflect on the roles that addiction and codependency have played in your life. How have they had an impact on you? Are there any cycles of addiction or codependency that have repeated in your life? If so, how? What might you do differently now that you know about the connection between codependency and addiction? Jot a few notes down. Okay, so we've defined codependency at length and also established its connection to addiction, as well as the other steps within the cycle of anxious attachment. But what are some early warning signs that you might be falling into codependent tendencies or territory? Let's unpack them. The first warning sign that you might be getting into codependent territory is that you are canceling or refraining from making plans in the hopes that you'll see a romantic interest. Your routine goes right out the window the second that you meet someone that you're interested in. Another sign, and this is related to enmeshment, which remember is the engine in the vehicle of codependency, and that is rushing physical intimacy. Having sex very early on in a relationship is an attempt to enmesh, and it is a clear sign that you are in codependent territory. Another one, the third sign that you might be slipping into codependent tendencies, is an inconsistency with self-care. Self-neglect is a hallmark of codependency and also of anxious attachment. Again, codependency is a form of self-abandonment. So if you're not taking care of your mind, your body, and your spirit, it will catch up with you. It causes us to need a countering force. And as codependents and anxious attachers, that counterbalancing force is usually something or someone externally. And usually that is a romantic interest or partner. Another sign that you might be slipping into codependency is intense feelings of loneliness and isolation. Let me be real with you for a second here. You're most susceptible to experiencing codependency when you are least socially resourced, when you're least emotionally diversified, to reference back to what we discussed in the last episode, when you are least supported by the people closest to you. So if you are feeling super lonely and you're really isolated, if you're not reaching out to your friends, your family, your colleagues, if you're not deepening that relationship with yourself, if you're not connecting with nature and or a higher power, this will set you up for disaster. And it will cause you, again, to need that counterbalancing force externally and to seek codependency in the form of a connection with someone else. I think it's also important to recognize that codependency can show up in any relationship, not just romantic ones. It can show up with colleagues, with friends, with family. It's not limited just to a romantic partnership. Okay, final sign that you might be slipping into codependency is that you're stepping in to save or fix someone. Please don't make other people's issues your own. They are not your burdens to bear. If you feel like you need to step in and help, leave it. Let the other person figure it out. As I mentioned in the chapter, we step in to do this because we want other people to need us. But this is limiting for both people involved. Pain and discomfort are incredibly motivating. And when you step in to try to prevent someone else from feeling that pain, which is what we're trying to do in that moment, you prevent the other person from learning what that pain can actually teach them. That is problematic because that pain might be the straw that breaks the camel's back. It might be the last thing that ends up pushing and motivating them to grow and to change and to learn and to evolve in the ways that they need to. Do not do that. Please do not do that. Now, I can talk about codependency pretty freely here, and that is because I have been there more times than I would ever care to admit. But one of the more recent and extreme examples is from 4 years ago when I moved from New York City to Charleston, South Carolina. Now, when I moved here, the only person that I knew was my real estate agent. I didn't have any friends or any other connections that lived here. So it was sort of starting over from a social standpoint. Of course, I still had my friends elsewhere. But point being, I didn't have anyone in close proximity that I could really see or hang out with. That set me up for disaster. 3 weeks after I relocated here to Charleston, South Carolina, I met someone and we hit it off. And things progressed very quickly until we were basically spending almost all of our time, our free time, together. I allowed that connection to consume my life until I was completely dependent on him for social connection. Obviously, that's problematic. Obviously, that put a lot of pressure on the relationship, and it had that equal and opposite effect of intensity, and it ended just as intensely as it began. That experience was also incredibly valuable because it helped me to learn the lesson underneath of that struggle, which is that I'm responsible for my social connection. I'm responsible for my emotional diversification. I'm responsible for taking care of myself. And all of that went out the window in that experience. And again, a lot of that also had to do with the fact that I was very much disconnected from a social standpoint at that time. I was not socially resourced at that moment. That led to the dissolution of that relationship, which is okay. We weren't meant for each other anyway. And that likely would have come out in one form or another eventually. And as you can hear me talking about this, I hope that you see how much grace I'm giving myself and how much compassion I have for myself, even though I repeated a pattern that I knew was there. Sometimes that has to happen in order for us to break the pattern. We've got to repeat it one final time or repeat it in some sort of form or way in order to learn the lesson. And trust me when I say that I did. Please have the same grace and compassion with yourself. It is okay that sometimes you repeat behaviors. Learn what you can. Recognize the interventions that you need to make in order to prevent this from happening again. And that leads us to the third and final aspect of codependency that I want to unpack in today's episode. How can I address my codependent tendencies? 1, please bring the focus back to yourself. Earlier, when I was talking about those extremes of independence and dependence, if you are so dependent on someone, on one person, to the point where you're losing a sense of self, of independence, obviously the way to balance back out to the center here, to a middle path, is to grow more independent and less reliant on a singular person. Emotional diversification also relates to this. Your relationship with yourself is a form of diversification away from codependent relationships or dynamics. You also need to explore ways that you can connect with other people and to be very socially resourced around you. The second thing that you can focus on to interrupt or combat your codependent tendencies is to stick to your routine. Be flexible, yes, but please make sure that you stick to your habits. Proactively practice self-care. Hang out with your friends and people who fill up your cup of love. And prioritize your hobbies and passions and goals and interests. Do not throw all of that out the window when you meet someone that you're interested in. Not only will that prevent you from growing more codependent, but it's also deeply attractive to other people to know that you have other stuff going on in your life. It makes you more complex. It makes you more interesting. So please stick to your routine. The third and final way that you might be able to address your codependent tendencies here is to draw a line in the sand. This is what I can give without overextending myself and growing resentful. This is what works for me in this situation. This is the boundary that will allow me to love you and me simultaneously. So draw that line in the sand for yourself. Do not step over it. Do not try to save someone. Don't look at somebody else as your savior. Remember that relationships are a wonderful addition to our lives, but one person cannot be our end-all, be-all, and you cannot be that for them either. All right, folks, that brings us to the end of today's episode on how to conquer or combat codependency. I really appreciate everyone tuning in today and want to leave with some resources. First things first, my book, Needy No More, The Journey from Anxious to Secure Attachment, is available on Amazon now. I've read a few chapters already in various episodes, so if they've resonated with you, I hope you'll explore getting a copy of your own. And if you're ready to dive deep into some of the principles we've been exploring on the podcast, some of the steps in the cycle of anxious attachment, and really truly break that cycle and interrupt your patterns, I would be honored to join you on your healing journey. You can explore more about my coaching program and set up a free consultation at Cracklife, CRACKLIFFE.com/coaching. Sending love to all. I'll see you next week on the podcast.